Hello, loyal Ship and Sip attendees and community members. Last month's Ship and Sip may be well in the review for us now, and I'm sure you're still anxiously awaiting this month's Ship and Sip. But if you're anything like me, waiting is the absolute worst. So we are excited to introduce our brand new on-demand series, After the Sip, where we will be answering some of your questions we were unable to answer live, introducing you to a ShipStation expert, and having just a little bit of fun along the way. This episode's guest may be familiar to you as he was one of our guests during January's Ship and Sip and has been a guest on Ship and Sip before. Please welcome the head of industry relations and strategic partnerships and this episode's ShipStation expert, Krish Iyer. Hey, Krish.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well.
Good, good. Krish, can you tell those of us that don't know a little bit more about what you do for ShipStation?
Sure. I act as our face to the media, and I also oversee our strategic partnerships, mainly with marketplaces and selling channels.
Awesome. That sounds like quite a bit.
It's a lot,
Yeah.
but it's great and it's a lot of fun, and get to meet some great people along the way.
Awesome. I love to hear it. Okay, so we're going to start out with a quick icebreaker. And I want to know if there was one candy or type of food in this world that you could banish from existence forever, what would it be?
Ooh, gosh. Well, the easy answer would be candy corn.
Right?
But I would probably say Peeps. From Easter, I would probably say Peeps for sure.
Yeah, Peeps are the worst, and they keep making new flavors. You can't just add flavor to something terrible and it's going to be magic.
I have to say this question now, it's going to probably keep me awake at like 2 a.m.
No. Well, don't worry about it. Hopefully you don't have like dreams about like rabid Peeps.
No, just about shipping and return.
Well, speaking about shipping, let's jump into it. We're going to start off with some quick questions here that we were not able to get on our live event. So let's start out with the first one. With the COVID vaccine on the horizon and the possibility of things starting to open back up, do you think this could affect our sales projections for 2021?
I think it could, in that number one, you're going to have people hopefully having more ability to go out and do things and buy and doing more activities. On the other hand, a lot of new shoppers got used to shopping online that maybe hadn't before. In particular, people that are in rural areas, maybe older consumers. I think of my parents who, may buy some things online, but during the pandemic, it accelerated their use of especially groceries online and other things of that nature. So I do think that necessity is the mother of invention. And so therefore, those habits that were created and with the convenience, I do think a lot of the volume could be permanent and here to stay.
That makes sense. I mean, it's a new habit, and some people who have adopted this realize that there's a bit more ease to it.
For sure. For
Yeah,
sure.
I definitely see that being the case. Now, do you think that this might signal a downturn in e-commerce in general, or do you think, kind of like you were saying before, that maybe we'll still see some sustained or even an increase?
I think what both factors can be true,
Mhm.
meaning we could still see a lot of volume increasing in e-commerce, but then in certain segments or sectors, that it could go down. Overall, though, I mean, people are expecting certainly package volume to go up. But the other factor to it is that a lot of businesses that had to pivot in the pandemic to selling products online, or new entrepreneurs, once they've discovered that as a viable revenue stream, that means that they're going to continue that. If we think, for example, of our user that had joined the call during our last Sip and Ship, about the idea of having to pivot a little bit to sell more of the health and beauty products online. Well, that is a very viable revenue stream. So even if people get more back into personal services at the spas and salons, they're still going to find that those types of businesses, if they had to pivot, now find that as a good revenue stream. So I think the volume will certainly continue, certainly in e-commerce.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, once you do something, you're not going to be like, oh, well, the world's opened up. I'm just going to turn off this extra source of revenue.
For sure, for sure.
Now, this one is the fun one, and we tackled this a little bit on our last Ship and Sip. But we all know there's congestion going on right now, and there's not much that we can do to fix the congestion. But what recommendations would you make to businesses right now to be ahead of the curve on this?
Sure. I'd say the first thing is that there's no way to sugarcoat this. There are shipping delays and carrier capacity issues, so plan accordingly. Meaning, are you communicating in your product listing itself on your own, whether it's on your own direct channel or a marketplace listing? Are you communicating what the shipping expectations are, not only in the listing? A lot of merchants might be afraid to do that because they're afraid, oh, is that going to put somebody off? Better to do that in the listing and in the checkout and afterwards. If there are delays, don't rely on your customer to have to go back in and track it. Be proactive on the shipping delays and what the actual delivery promise is. That's the first thing. The
Mhm.
second is having a diversified carrier strategy. Um, for a long time, we saw a lot of people saying, you know what, I need to consolidate all of my volume and use one carrier that'll give me better economies of scale and efficiencies on pickup. And that may be true, but during the pandemic, it's really important to have a good sense of what the carriers can do. And what I mean by that specifically is not only, hey, what carriers may be having some delays, what services they offer, but also, simply put, some carriers are better for some lanes meaning destinations, than others. And so some of it is trial and error. So really having a diversified carrier strategy being you have the knowledge, doesn't mean you necessarily execute on it, but having the ability to know knowledgeably what a carrier does, be able to make those agile shifts if needed, becomes super important. And then, Aaron, I would say third would be returns.
Mhm.
And we're going to hopefully talk a lot about returns. So I don't want to steal too much thunder, but just to know that frictionless returns experiences are extremely important and no longer a nice to have, they're a need to have.
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely going to hit on returns. But pivoting a little bit to strategy on terms of demand instead of shipping, how can and are companies keeping up with this increased demand and also competition from big box companies like Amazon?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it is for a lot of consumers. They when we've surveyed our users, they've said they like that local aspect. They like giving business to small, medium retailers. So a lot of small to medium retailers are actually even in marketplace listing, really pumping up their local status to pump up and drive those local sales. We're a small business. We're located here. So I would say that's a big piece of it is pumping up the local aspect. That's one. The second is, are you offering things like curbside pickup, maybe even curbside returns, so that people can buy from you locally? So I think that in terms of competing against larger box retailers, that the local angle is super important. And that's the same thing with returns, is that it may be a lot easier to encourage somebody to come in and drop off a return, especially if you have a frictionless process
Mhm.
versus the prospect of having to do that via a marketplace or with a big box retailer where there may be a little bit of friction.
Right. It's really funny to see this transition because up until this point, it was all about being global and expanding. And now we're kind of coming to that point where local is becoming more important. And it's interesting to kind of see that shift.
It is, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say global is very important. And
Mhm.
the reason why I say that is right now is, especially if you're in the US or to the north, my good friends in Canada, now is the best time to plan to sell your products internationally. Why would I say that? Well, the first is that normally to sell your products cross border, there's a bit of friction around things like shipping costs or delivery lead times. If you're in Australia, are you willing to wait a couple weeks? Well, people are now very much used to that. Um, and so, with some of those points of friction being sort of understood by people right now, I would say the retailers that are actually investing in international right now are going to really have dividends when things, really get back to quote unquote normal, because they invested that time and effort now during times when expectations are maybe a little lower on delivery and visibility and things like that. They're working out those kinks now so that when things return to normal, they have that much more of an advantage at that time. In addition to the fact of things like Brexit, meaning that trade from the UK becomes
Right.
a bit more difficult, certainly for our friends in the US and in Canada. And Mexico shouldn't discount our good friends to the south either. That the retailers and brands that are there are going to be at a real unique advantage for those that invested in that now during the pandemic. So
Yeah.
it's both local and it's international.
What is that saying? It's act local, think global.
Mhm. For sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you for answering our quick questions here. And now that we're all warmed up, we're going to get you onto our topic of the day, returns. Krish, I feel like you might be the king of returns knowledge, so I'd be totally remiss to not make this
Thank
our
you.
topic today.
Thank you. Well, it embarrassingly, if I am the quote unquote king of returns, I totally want a T-shirt that says that. By the way,
I'm on it. I will
uh,
get you one.
thank you. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I have some holiday presents that are in my car that need to get returned, and they have been for it's February 5th, and they have been since Christmas time or earlier. So
Oh,
even the king of returns doesn't get around to doing his returns.
man, they might take your title away. Be careful who you tell.
That's true. That's true.
So, talk to me. What is the future of returns? I know
Sure.
that's a really broad question, but
I think it's a multifaceted answer. First, we saw a big article in the Wall Street Journal about the idea of Walmart and some other big box retailers telling consumers to keep it as a return, kind of a sugar returns strategy. We'll talk, maybe in a little bit about what the definition of sugar returns is. But the idea that with the cost that's in place to process the return and how messy it is, as I mentioned, I have returns that are sitting in my car. Enough retailers just say, you know what, we're going to credit you back, just keep it for now. I would say that may end up being a popular option. Second, I would say that the concept of re-commerce, meaning people selling on marketplaces, eBay's invested in some things around re-commerce. Certainly, you're seeing a lot of like your ThreadUps and others, that deal with vintage clothing, things like that are used. So I think the re-commerce market will be a big trend. I've mentioned the idea of curbside returns. And somebody that really invests in that is probably going to make a lot of money in doing that. And the idea that, well, a lot of us just don't want to go in and deal with making the return in the store. And maybe we don't even want to deal with going into a location to ship it. But if I could have a happy medium of somewhere that I drop it off and do it, and then I get the credit back, then that's something that can really really be a strong value proposition. But the final thing on returns is something I said earlier, that the folks that do fast and frictionless returns are going to be the ones that win. So I think that the trend that we'll see is really a lot of retailers, particularly in apparel, like a certain degree of friction in returns, because the reality is we may order 3 different sizes, 2 different colors, and not return any of them. And there's a certain level of profit that's built. But the reality is that long term, your customer perception, even though I may not have gotten around to doing the returns, my perception as a consumer is then negatively affected, with that retailer, even though it may be illogical to think, well, I didn't get around to the return, but still that's how customer perceptions work. So I think you'll probably see just a lot less friction in that returns process, certainly along the way.
Right. And that definitely makes sense. If things are too difficult to return, or I see like a really like rigid return policy on a web page above the fold, kind of makes me feel a little iffy about purchasing nowadays. And actually wanted to talk about that. What recommendations in regards to returns would you make to businesses that are either just starting up or making a shift, or who are trying to rethink returns to maximize their success?
Sure. I would say that having returns isn't a reflection on your product being bad.
Mm.
Uh, that would be the first thing I would say, is that there is always going to be some degree of returns. But having said that, it goes back to one of my favorite axioms, which is how do you dismantle an atomic bomb? Don't build one to begin with. And so it's the same idea that better listings, better product photos, more accurate sizes, good reviews and encouraging feedback. Those things really do help to lower your return rate. So the same idea, can we not uh, have to dismantle an atomic bomb by not building it to begin with? Same idea on returns. Can we get some of those initial steps right? But inevitably, you will have some degree of returns. And so, therefore, rather than creating friction, can we create good options, either on returns portals that allow the user to initiate that return, number one, ways to make that frictionless, free shipping for that return, regardless of reason on satisfaction. So those would be the things that I would say would be the things that really retailers starting out should do. The last thing, and kind of tying back into the international concept, is that returns can be cultural as well. So certain countries and cultures, Germany, France, other ones, can have a culture of a higher rate of returns than the US. So it's important to look at what does your customer base look like, and then evaluate, sometimes based on the culture and cultural nuances, on what your return policy is if you do sell your products internationally.
That's interesting that they have higher return rates. Is there a specific like cultural reason why that is, or is it just the way that they are predisposes them to being more comfortable with that process?
I think it's because number one, they're just more comfortable with it in general. Right, in the US, we can sometimes perceive returns as a perception of quality.
Mhm.
Also, for years, a lot of people would go to the quote unquote parcel shop, meaning a place that's a general store, convenience, things like that. So it's a lot more common to have that foot traffic in locations, as opposed to you bought it from a retailer and you have to go all the way back to that retailer to do it. So I think that may have some cultural roots there, but it's just important to look at what that customer base looks like and then create your policies accordingly.
Right. I mean, it definitely seems like we're moving into putting the human element into returns a little bit more, thinking about things like that. Going on to COVID again, I mean, I feel like we can't have a conversation without talking about it. What impact has increased e-commerce demands and COVID regulations had on returns?
I think it's increased them for sure. but it has certainly created certain friction points of demand. So, for example, if I buy apparel and I buy it online and I decide I want to return it, what does the retailer think of that? I mean, there's especially in light of COVID, a quality assurance factor associated with it. I mean, quite honestly, it's a little gross to think about. To that, okay, I buy something online, it got delivered to my house, I tried it on. What if I had COVID and I'm returning it? So I do think that one of the demands that we're seeing right now is what is that return processing process and what are the costs that I'm going to have to allocate as a result of it. So I think certainly, are we seeing a lot of returns? Sure. um, are there new things that we have to take into account, like the quality assurance? Sure. But the other thing that I would say is, what is truly the return window? So normally, we think of holiday shopping. If you're anything like me, you wait till the last minute, and then the return season starts on the 26th.
Mhm.
Okay, and depending on the type of product, it could last all the way up into even March. Okay, that's the normal paradigm. Most of us think of January as the returns month, but holiday shopping this past year with COVID, whether it was because of long lead times or because of a fear of a lack of inventory, or hoarding, meant that people started as soon as July, August. I'll give you a little story. Um, when I first saw some of our user data that said that people had started their holiday shopping as soon as July, August, I was so floored. And I told my wife that, and she said, "Yeah, I've already gotten my shopping done." This was in September. She said, "Yeah, I got it done a month ago." um, which explained why we had so many boxes in our home. But I thought she would just, new furniture that we were going to use. But as far as boxes are concerned, but um, if the holiday season started as soon as July, August, from the buying the item to give as a gift during the holidays, then what is the reasonable returns window if the purchase was made all the way in July, August, but probably may not have been given as a gift until December? So do we have to have an equal returns window as a result of that? What really is reasonable? And the truth is, there's not a good answer to that question, but it is a consideration that that purchase season started so much earlier. So therefore, what does that mean as far as kind of that elastic band on the return cycle?
Interesting. That's really interesting to think about. Do you think that because of this, that more retailers are maybe abandoning like the 90-day rule or kind of working with it because, you enforce the 90-day rule, you lose a customer? I mean,
Sure. I think so. I think that that's definitely, in light of COVID, something that retailers have probably had to adopt during this time, for sure.
so for the first time in a while, we're starting to see kind of like a spark of hope that we're coming towards, hopefully, I don't want to jinx anything, a post-COVID world. Do you think that these changes and innovations will stick and be sustainable? And if not, which ones do you think might start to fall by the wayside?
I don't know if we'll see anything falling by the wayside per se, but I do think that businesses that might have been services only that had to pivot, like the gentleman who owned the spa and then started selling products via his website, you're going to start to see that mixed model become the norm. That would be
Mhm.
one change. The second is, I mentioned things like curbside pickup, curbside returns. I think that those things will become the new normal. Grocery shopping, in particular, about delivery. To be honest, pre-pandemic, it existed, but frankly, was fairly awkward. I didn't do it very often, just because the process of the delivery, the checkout, it just felt very awkward. But again, necessity being the mother of invention, now I'm more used to it. Amazon, Whole Foods, things like that, that now I can't even imagine going to the grocery store.
Right.
So I
especially with all the curbside and all of that.
Right, exactly. So I think some of those trends will be things that we start to see. I do think also you're starting to see a few services out there that actually are saying, okay, try before you buy, meaning in apparel and other things. Okay, let's say, we're all used to Stitch Fix and some others that you get a subscription box, but other ones that, okay, you get the item, you try it on and see if you like it, and then you're charged if you keep it. And if you're not, then you're sending it back at their expense, and then that factors into their long-term profit and loss model. So I do think some degree of that is going to become popular in the future.
Definitely. I remember back in the day where it was just beds, that beds would do the try before you buy thing. And now everyone's doing it, which is really interesting to see.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I think in apparel in particular, you may see that type of model.
Mhm. Definitely. So, a little bit earlier, you talked about sugar returns and re-commerce. Can you go into a little bit more depth about each of these? Like, what is sugar returns for somebody who wouldn't know?
Sure. So we would define sugar returns as saying, do you have employ a keep it philosophy?
Mhm.
I have bought an item and I wish to return it, but for whatever reason, processing costs, shipping costs, item item value was too low, or I just don't want to deal with it. You tell the consumer to keep it. So sugar, here you go. You just keep it.
Mhm.
Was very popular when it came to cross border, meaning, okay, I'm in the US and I sold something to somebody in the UK. Is it really reasonable, even if my item selling price might be $50, to pay for the shipping back or to do any of that processing or may inconvenience my customer? Some retailers liked doing that because they felt like that was a disincentive to fraud, but the thought process around that is changing quite a bit to say sugar returns, it's cheaper for us, it's more convenient for the customer, and frankly, the item value is just not worth it to do that. So I think over time we'll probably see sugar returns become a norm for items under a certain value or threshold, or based on certain markets, like in health and beauty. Very very difficult to return something, and certainly can't resell it.
Yeah, especially when you're talking international with customs and returns,
Right,
when you have
right.
perishable products like face creams or things like that. It gets
Hmm.
difficult.
For sure.
Yeah, and so re-commerce, you were talking about like not Stitch Fix, but like ThreadUp, right?
Mhm. So what I mean there is you're starting to see a big movement of, people going on certain re-commerce websites of saying the return is taken, it's refurbished and resold. We used to think of it a lot in electronics,
Mhm.
that re-commerce was the main use case, but we're starting to see that in apparel. We're starting to see that in other industries, that going to a re-commerce based marketplace becomes very attractive, because you can get a discount on an item that is still very high quality. And I think to the idea of that rubber band type of analogy of, we started the process here early on shopping, and the returns window needs to be here. Well, I do think companies in re-commerce, meaning that may buy some degree of inventory at a small fractional cost and then resell it, I do think that that's going to become a very popular option. We may also think of it as liquidation, meaning, uh, I'm a retailer, I've sold a product, rather than taking the return. All right, you know what? I'm a party out there that could buy it for pennies on the dollar. At least I've made something and I don't have to be inconvenienced with the inventory costs. There's value there.
Right, right, 100%. Yeah, that makes sense, and we're definitely seeing a lot of it. I guess, it makes more sense to get something back than to completely have something that you can't resell.
Yes, for sure.
So, do you think that we're starting to hit the point where return policies will become more prominent in marketing and targeting strategies?
I think they will. I think the policies, I think marketplaces themselves will start to really enforce quite a few policies around returns.
Mhm.
Uh, One other trend on returns that we didn't talk about that I think could become popular here um, is the idea of I've bought an item, I want to return it, somebody else has purchased the item. Could there be some degree of self quality assurance that allows that user to almost act as an intermediary to get an item to somebody else? And that is a possibility.
That's interesting. So, in this scenario, would the money change hands between the business and the new purchaser, and then the purchaser who has it sends it to the next person?
I would think maybe with the original marketplace,
Got
meaning, let's say I bought something on the marketplace. I got the item. I want to return it. I've contacted the retailer to say, "Hey, let me return this." Well, the third party who wants to buy that item then maybe is given the option: "Can I buy? Do you want to buy this at a discount from somebody who's returning?" And then the label that gets sent, instead of going back to the original retailer, then is going to that other party who has enjoyed hopefully some sort of cost benefit. Um, as a result of not having to go through that quality assurance process of return, verifying that the item is what it is, but I'm taking on a little bit of risk as the final party because it hasn't gone through that QA, but maybe I'm getting a cost savings as a result.
right. Right. That's really interesting.
It'd be easier said than done.
Right. Yeah, there are some factors, but in a perfect world, that sounds ideal for all parties involved.
My boss sends me a holiday package every year, and every year it has fruitcake, and it makes me think that that's exactly what I'm going to do with the fruitcake that I
Just
got.
send it on to the next person. Krish, if I get fruitcake, I'm gonna be so bad. Then I'll know. Maybe we'll just start a chain, see how far the fruitcake can get.
There you go. That's an idea.
So I do have one more question here. I want to know your feelings about return fraud. It seems like a very fine line to walk here, and obviously, last question kind of feeds in perfectly. Have there been any strategies that you've seen that kind of curb this without alienating or leaving a bad taste in the mouth of consumers?
I think it's a risk reward because if you think a lot of retailers with the old way of thinking was, well, I have to have some friction in the return process
Mhm.
to thwart fraud. But the reality is when you're not thinking more broadly about, well, what's the cost of returns? What's the cost of that versus the potential fraud? And in general, depending on the item and sector, the amount of fraud is low. And there are tools out there, Riskify, some other ones that do allow the retailer to assess some degree of fraud risk in the cart of that purchaser, zip code, things like that. So I do think there is some degree um, of tools that can kind of help stave that off. Number one. But the reality is when we're talking about items with a relatively low selling price, the risk of fraud is somewhat minimal.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly on higher end items you may find that have a much higher selling price. The risk of fraud goes up exponentially, and certainly on internationally, we all know certain destination countries that are rife for fraud, fraudulent shipments, fraudulent orders. I won't throw any country names under the bus here, certainly in saying it, but we all know who some of the usual suspects are in that regard.
Mhm. Definitely. And I think you're right. I think it depends on the items, but I feel like we're coming into an age where companies have more agency and options here.
For sure, for sure.
Wow. So I feel like I know so much more about returns. Like, Could be the returns apprentice now. You've been an amazing.
Well, you're hired.
Yes, finally. You've been such an amazing guest today, Krish. Before we
Thank
go, I was wondering if you had any final words of wisdom to share with our community.
I'd say that 2021 is also shaping up to be a big year in e-commerce, but certainly also a tough year for all of us personally. And we're all still getting through it together and learning our way, and nobody has all the answers.
Right? You don't have all the answers.
No,
Are you sure?
I don't. Don't tell my wife, though.
I promise I won't say a word. Well, thank you again for talking to us. It's been such a pleasure talking to you as always. And I want to thank you at home for joining us on demand. To keep this conversation going, we're doing a giveaway. Don't worry, it's not Krish's fruitcake. All you need to do is comment below telling us something that you learned today, or maybe something that you want us to focus on in the future. And you'll be entered to win a ShipStation community swag pack. More information is going to be listed on the post below, but until next time, this has been After the Sip. Now go get out of here and get shipping.